I woke up that morning with a strange weight on my chest, the kind that comes when life is trying to tell you something before you even step out the door. And as I sat on the edge of my small bed, I softly asked anyone watching to like and subscribe if they felt connected to these moments of my life. Because this story starts on the day I first crossed paths with the man who would later become my husband, though back then I didn't know anything about him, except that he walked like he owned a world I had only seen from far away. And even as I washed my face in that tiny room with peeling paint, I felt the first quiet reminder of the title I gave you. Because money can hide a lot of things on the outside, but it can't hide the pain people carry deep inside. And I was about to see that truth standing right in front of me, though I was still too young to understand the weight of his eyes, or the way he tried to cover something behind a calm smile. And when I stepped outside to start that long walk toward the diner where I worked, the air felt different, like the day was moving me toward something important, whether I was ready or not. And that was when I saw him for the very first time, leaning against a fancy car that didn't belong on my side of town, looking lost even though his clothes showed he came from money. And for a moment, our eyes met in a way that made me freeze, because I felt like I was looking at someone who had everything and nothing at the same time. And before I could look away, he asked me for directions in a soft voice that sounded like he didn't want anyone to notice he was hurting. So I pointed him toward the main road, trying to stay calm, trying to keep my mask on, but he kept looking at me as if he wanted to say more. And I didn't know why a rich man would look at a poor girl that long, or why his hands were shaking like he had just walked away from something heavy. And while I walked off to keep from staring back, he suddenly called after me, asking if I worked nearby and if he could walk with me for a moment. And that request made something in my stomach tighten, because I didn't know what a man like him wanted from a girl like me. Yet something about his voice sounded tired, almost broken, and it made me pause instead of running off like I usually did around strangers. So I nodded and let him walk a few steps beside me, both of us pretending it was nothing, both of us hiding more than we were saying. And right then, I felt the smallest tug inside my chest, the kind that hints your life is about to shift in a way you can't undo. But I didn't know if letting him walk with me was a mistake or the start of something bigger. And as we reached the corner of the street, he finally asked me a question that made me stop moving completely, leaving me wondering what I had stepped into and why his voice shook when he asked it. And that question is something I still remember today, even after all these years. But I didn't answer him right away, because I was too stunned to understand why he would ask me that. He looked at me with those tired eyes and asked in a voice so low it barely held itself together if I knew a place nearby where a person could sit alone without being judged. And the way he said "alone" made me feel something cold move through my chest, because rich people in my world were never alone unless something had cracked inside them. So I hesitated before pointing toward the quiet bench near the old bus stop. But instead of thanking me and walking off, he asked if I could show him, and that small request made me feel the ground shift under my feet, because men like him didn't ask girls like me for anything except the time of day. Yet there he was, waiting for my answer like he needed it more than he wanted to admit. So I nodded slowly and led him down the narrow street filled with chipped walls, old bikes, and laundry lines hanging from windows, and I could feel him watching everything around us, not with disgust, but with a strange mix of confusion and longing, as if he had never walked through a place where life showed itself without filters. And while we walked, he asked if I grew up here, and I kept my answer short, because the last thing I wanted was pity from someone who could buy 10 houses and never feel the weight of bills pressing on his chest. But he didn't look at me with pity. He looked at me like someone who was trying to remember what real life felt like. And when we reached the bench, he didn't sit right away. He just stood there staring at it, like he was fighting something inside his head, and I watched him because I couldn't help it, wondering what kind of pain could hide behind the clean lines of his shirt and the shine of his watch. And then he finally sat down, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tight, like he was holding himself together with nothing but his fingers. And he asked me if I ever felt like life was pushing me in a direction I didn't choose. And for a second, I didn't know if he was talking to me or just thinking out loud. But the honesty in his voice made me sit down a little distance away from him, keeping my mask on, but letting him talk, because there was something in him that felt familiar. The way people from both sides of life hide their bruises differently, but hurt the same. And he told me he had just walked away from a house full of people who praised him, but didn't really see him, and that he didn't know who he was without all the money and expectations tied to his name. And hearing that made my chest tight, because it was the first time I realized rich people had their own kind of hunger, one that didn't show on their bodies, but lived deep in their hearts. And as he talked, the morning light hit his face in a way that made him look both young and tired. And I found myself listening more than I planned, drawn into a story that wasn't mine, but felt connected to the path I was walking. And I had no idea why he trusted me enough to speak so openly. But I felt something pull me closer, something quiet and warm, something I didn't want to admit out loud. And just when I thought he was done, he turned toward me and asked a question that made my breath catch. A question no stranger had ever asked me. A question that made me wonder if I should stand up and run or stay, and hear the truth behind it. And his voice shook again when he repeated it, making me feel like the next word I said could open a door I wasn't sure I was ready to walk through. When he asked me that question again, his voice softer this time, he wanted to know if I ever wished I could walk into a different life, even for a moment. And for a second, I couldn't breathe, because he was asking something I spent my whole childhood thinking about. Yet, I never said it out loud to anyone, not even to myself, in the dark of those long nights, when hunger and fear shared the same space. So I kept my eyes on the ground and told him that wishing for another life was something poor folks did quietly, like a small prayer we never expected to be answered. And when he heard that, something in him shifted, almost like my words hit a place he didn't let anyone touch. And he leaned back on the bench with a long breath, the kind people take when they're fighting a truth they've been avoiding. And he told me he wished he could step out of his rich life too, just for a moment, because everyone expected something from him. And no one ever asked him what he wanted for himself. And hearing that made me look at him in a different way, realizing he wasn't running from wealth, he was running from a life built for him instead of by him. And the silence between us grew heavy, not uncomfortable, but thick with thoughts we weren't ready to speak. And while we sat there, an old woman pushing a grocery cart passed by and looked at us with one of those knowing glances that made me feel exposed, as if she saw something forming between me and this stranger before we did. And he noticed her look too, asking me if people in my neighborhood always stared at newcomers. But I told him they only stared when something unusual happened, like seeing a rich man sitting on a broken bench with a poor girl in a place his shoes weren't made for. And he laughed under his breath, not a loud laugh, just a small one that sounded like it came from a place he hadn't visited in a long time. And that small laugh made something warm spread in me, even though I tried to ignore it. And he asked if he was making me uncomfortable, but I told him the truth, that I didn't know yet, because I couldn't understand why he was talking to me this way or what he expected from this moment. And instead of reassuring me, he surprised me by saying he didn't expect anything. He just needed a real conversation with someone who didn't know his world or his family name, someone who wouldn't try to impress him or pull him into something he wasn't ready for. And his honesty made me look at him longer than I should have, seeing the pain he was trying to keep hidden behind his calm face, but also seeing a softness that didn't match the polished world he came from. And before I could speak again, he asked me if I had time to keep talking or if I needed to get to work. And that question made my heart squeeze, because I knew being late could cost me my shift. But something inside me told me this man was about to change the direction of my day, and maybe my whole life, and I couldn't decide if staying was foolish or brave, which left me sitting there caught between the life I knew and the one that was quietly reaching out to me through his wounded voice, making me wonder what would happen if I chose to stay just a little longer. I sat there trying to decide if staying with him would pull me into something I wasn't ready for. And the more I thought about walking away, the harder it became to move, because there was something in the way he watched me that didn't feel like the usual rich-poor divide I grew up seeing. It felt more like two people standing at the edge of their own silent battles. And when I finally told him I still had a little time before my shift, the relief in his eyes was so quiet and honest that it made my chest feel strange, almost unsteady. So I stayed on that bench, even though my mind kept warning me not to trust a man who had everything while I had so little. And he began talking again, slower this time, telling me how his family expected him to take over a business he never cared about, a life already planned for him before he even learned what he wanted. And while he spoke, he kept rubbing his thumb over the edge of his watch, as if he was trying to wear away the reminder of where he came from. And I found myself studying him the way I studied people at the diner, looking for signs of who they really were beneath the surface. And the more he talked, clearer it became that money hadn't protected him from pressure, loneliness, or the weight of being shaped by other people's choices. And when he asked me what I wanted from life, I almost laughed because no one had ever asked me that before, not in a real way. So I told him I wanted something simple, a life where I didn't have to worry about whether the next day would break me or carry me. A life where I could breathe without counting every coin in my pocket. And he listened with a stillness that felt unusual, like my words mattered in a way they never had before. And his expression softened so much that I had to look away for a moment just to steady myself. Because standing this close to a world I never belonged to felt dangerous, not because of him, but because part of me was afraid of wanting anything from him at all. And when I finally looked back at him, he asked me if he could walk me to work when the time came, saying it in a quiet tone that didn't sound like flirting or pushing. Just a simple request wrapped in something gentle. And that gentleness made me feel a small pull toward him. A pull I didn't fully understand, but before I could answer, a familiar voice called my name from down the street. A voice that made me stiffen and look over my shoulder. And the moment I saw who it was, I felt the air around me shift, because the person walking toward us was the last person I wanted to see sitting with a rich stranger who looked like he didn't belong anywhere near my world, leaving me caught between two sides of my life that weren't meant to meet. The moment I saw my cousin Leon walking toward us, my stomach tightened, because he was the kind of man who noticed everything, especially when something didn't fit the picture he believed our lives were supposed to stay in. And the sight of me sitting on a bench with a rich stranger was exactly the kind of thing he would turn into trouble without even trying. So I straightened up and tried to act calm, hoping Leon would just keep walking, but he didn't. He slowed down and looked at the man beside me with an expression that carried old frustration and quiet warning. And I could feel the stranger beside me sensing the tension even before Leon spoke, because his posture shifted, almost protective, but still unsure. And Leon asked me who I was sitting with in a tone that made me feel 12 years old again, hiding things I never meant to hide. So I told him it was nothing serious, just someone asking for directions. But Leon's eyes were sharp, moving from the man's clothes to the car parked down the street. And he gave me a look that said he didn't believe a word I said. And I hated how that made me feel, like I had done something wrong, when all I had done was listen to a stranger who felt more honest with me than most people I knew. And the man must have sensed the shift, because he stood up slowly and offered his name to Leon, trying to keep things calm. But Leon didn't shake his hand. He just nodded with that stiff politeness poor folks use around rich people when they feel judged even before a word is said. And the stranger didn't push it. He just lowered his hand and glanced at me as if checking whether I wanted him to stay or walk away. And that look made my heart thud, because it wasn't romantic or dramatic. It was simple and real, like he didn't want to leave me in a bad place, but he also didn't want to cause trouble. And before I could decide what to do, Leon stepped a little closer and asked me if I shouldn't already be at work. His his tone heavy with the reminder that we couldn't afford to play with time the way rich folks could. And that reminder made my chest sink because he was right. I was late. And the diner wasn't kind about lateness, but the stranger quietly said he didn't want to get me in trouble and offered again to walk me there. His voice low, steady, almost hopeful. And I didn't know why hearing that made something inside me ease, like he actually cared about the weight my day carried. But Leon's eyes narrowed in a way that made me step slightly back, not out of fear, but to keep things from turning into a scene. And I told Leon I'd meet him at home later, trying to end the moment before it grew into something bigger. But instead of calming down, Leon leaned toward me and whispered that rich men only came to our side of town when they needed something, and that warning hit me harder than I expected, leaving me standing there, unsure whether I should trust the stranger or trust the voice that had watched my back since childhood. And as I turned toward the man again, he asked me something so unexpected that it made the whole street feel still. A question that held more truth than I was ready to face, and the answer I gave him in that moment would shape the rest of the day in ways I didn't see coming. When he asked me if I wanted him to leave so my day wouldn't get any harder, his voice was so steady and respectful that it made me pause, because he wasn't asking out of pride or insult. He was giving me a choice, something life didn't offer often in my world. And for a moment, I just stood there, caught between Leon's warning ringing in my ears and the quiet honesty in this man's eyes. And the longer I looked at him, the more I realized he wasn't trying to force himself into my life. He was trying not to disturb it, and that small truth softened something in me, even though I didn't let it show. So I told him he didn't have to leave unless he wanted to, and the way his shoulders eased just a little told me he had been holding his breath, waiting for my answer. But before either of us could speak again, Leon muttered something under his breath and walked off, shaking his head like he already knew this day was going to bring trouble. And his reaction stung in a way I didn't expect, not because he was wrong to be cautious, but because he didn't see that this moment felt different, quieter, heavier, like the beginning of something I couldn't name. And once Leon was far enough down the street, the stranger looked at me and apologized for causing tension. But I told him it wasn't his fault. People in my world were taught to see danger in anything that looked out of place, especially rich men on poor streets. And he nodded slowly, like he understood exactly what I meant. And then he asked me again if he could walk me to the diner. But this time it wasn't a request wrapped in uncertainty. It was a simple offer, steady, careful, almost protective, without crossing any lines. And part of me wanted to say no, to keep my life simple and safe. But another part of me, one I didn't like admitting existed, wanted to let him walk with me, just to see where this strange connection might lead. So I told him he could come as long as he didn't mind the long walk and the rough sidewalks. And he smiled a small, tired smile that made me look away before he noticed the warmth rising in my face. And as we started walking side by side, the world around us felt unfamiliar, like the air had shifted, and the day was pushing me towards something I wasn't prepared for. And he asked me how long I had worked at the diner, his tone gentle enough to make me forget for a moment that we came from two different lives. And I answered, honestly, because hiding felt pointless with someone who was showing me his cracks without shame. But the closer we got to the diner, the faster my heart beat, not because of him, but because I could already see my manager through the window, tapping her foot with that look she gave when she was ready to cut someone's hours. And I knew walking in late with a rich man trailing behind me was going to get noticed in a way I wasn't ready for. But before I could warn him or ask him to stop, he said something that made me forget the fear for a moment, something soft and almost vulnerable, as if he was letting me see a part of him no one else got to witness. And his words made me step slower, wondering what exactly he expected from this morning, and why it felt like the story of my day was only just beginning. Right as the diner came into view, he told me he wasn't sure why walking beside me felt easier than walking through his own world. And those simple words made my steps slow, because they weren't coated in charm or meant to impress me. They were honest in a way that slipped past my guard before I could raise it. But the closer we got, the more I felt the weight of the moment pressing on my chest, because the windows were wide and clear, and my manager could see everything from the counter, including the fact that I was showing up late with a man who looked like he didn't belong anywhere near a place where folks paid in crumpled bills and scratched coins. And I started to tell him he should turn around so I wouldn't lose my job. But before I could finish, he gently asked if he was making my day harder. And even though the truth was yes, the way he asked made it impossible to say it out loud. So I just told him I could handle it, even if a part of me wasn't sure. And when we reached the door, he stopped walking and stood a little to the side, like he didn't want to step into the space that belonged to my world. And he asked if I'd be all right. And hearing that question made something inside me soften, because most people in my life didn't ask if I was all right. They asked if I was available, if I could cover a shift, if I could lend money, if I could be strong for them. But he asked it like he genuinely meant it. And that small difference echoed in my chest in a way I couldn't ignore. So I nodded and reached for the door, feeling the cool metal handle against my hand as a reminder that this moment was real, not some dream I'd wake from. And as I stepped inside, the bell above the door rang loud enough to make my manager turn toward me with that sharp look she saved for people who gave her reasons to cut hours. And before she could say anything, I glanced back through the glass, expecting him to be gone already. But he was still there, hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly lowered, like he was carrying a quiet worry he didn't know how to hide. And seeing him still waiting made my breath catch, because it told me this morning wasn't just a passing moment for him. It meant something, even if I couldn't name what yet. And I tried to pull my eyes away before my manager noticed, but it was too late. She followed my gaze and narrowed her eyes at him in a way that made heat rise up my neck. And she told me to come to the back, her voice clipped and cold, and I knew I was in trouble. But before I took another step, I looked back one more time, and he mouthed something I wasn't something so simple, yet so heavy, that it felt like the ground under me shifted again, and it made me wonder if this day was the beginning of a story I wasn't ready to tell. Because the look in his eyes told me he wasn't walking away from whatever was forming between us. Not yet, not today, and maybe not ever, leaving me frozen for a heartbeat, wondering what decision I was about to make without even knowing it. My manager led me into the back room with that stiff walk that always meant she'd been holding something in, and the moment the door shut, she asked why I was late in a tone that felt like a blade sliding across my nerves. And I stood there trying to explain without dragging him into it, saying the morning got complicated, but her eyes had already seen more than I wanted her to. And she told me plain and simple that showing up late was one thing, but showing up late with a rich man staring through her window made it look like I didn't take the job seriously. And hearing that made a burn rise behind my eyes, because she didn't understand that this morning wasn't planned. It wasn't foolishness or pride. It was something I didn't know how to walk away from even if I wanted to. So I apologized and told her it wouldn't happen again, though the words felt shaky coming out of my mouth, and she sighed the way she did when she knew she needed me but didn't want to show it. Then told me to get my apron on and get to work before the breakfast crowd thickened. And while she spoke, I kept thinking about him still standing outside, waiting like he didn't have another world to return to. And the thought made something warm flicker in my chest, even though it scared me a little too. So I tied my apron and stepped out onto the floor, trying to hide the storm inside me. And the moment the bell rang again, the sound cut through the diner like a reminder that my day wasn't done shifting. But I didn't look up right away because I needed to breathe, needed to steady myself. Yet, when I finally lifted my eyes, I saw him sitting in a corner booth, head down, hands folded, as if he was trying to make himself small enough not to disturb anything. And seeing him there made the whole room feel different, like the walls stretched wider and the air grew heavier. And there was something in the way he sat, quiet, unsure, waiting, that made my heart beat faster, even though I tried to keep my face calm. And I walked over to him because I had no choice, because ignoring him would only draw more attention. But as I reached his table, I told him softly he didn't have to stay, that I didn't want him wasting his morning in a place that didn't belong to his world. But he just looked up at me with eyes that held too much tired honesty and said he wasn't here to take up space. He just wanted to make sure I was all right. Words that hit me so deeply, I had to look away for a moment, pretending to adjust my apron so he wouldn't see the confusion crossing my face. And before I could ask what he wanted to order or suggest he leave, before someone started asking questions, he said something that stopped me cold in my tracks. Something simple, but heavy enough to make my breath hitch. Because it wasn't about food or time or directions. It was about why he was really here, sitting in a worn booth in a place he'd never step into under normal circumstances. And his words made me realize he wasn't planning to walk away from this morning. Not yet, not until he understood something he wasn't ready to say out loud. I followed David into the quiet street outside the diner, and the air felt colder than it should have been, like the world wanted me to pay attention what was coming next. And he walked beside me without speaking at first, hands in his pockets, eyes on the cracked road. And I kept waiting for him to look my way, because I needed something to break the tension left behind in that small diner booth. But he stayed quiet, so I was the one who finally asked if he was upset. And he shook his head fast, almost too fast, saying he wasn't. He just didn't like seeing me shrink myself for people who didn't care about me, and I felt something tighten in my chest, because no one had ever said something like that to me. Not in a way that felt like they were protecting me more than judging me. And we kept walking until we reached the corner where the streetlight flickered. And he stopped and turned to me fully like he had been working up the courage this whole time. And when he said he didn't want to see me walk alone, not tonight, not after the way those men laughed and mocked me, I felt the old habit kicking in. The mask I used to wear whenever life felt too heavy. The one that made me act like nothing mattered, even when everything did. But he kept staring at me with this calm worry that made the mask slip a little. And I told him I was used to it, used to being treated like I was less, used to pretending it didn't hurt, used to hiding the pain because it made people comfortable. And he shook his head again, like he refused to accept that, telling me I didn't deserve to live like that. And his voice was so steady, it made the whole street feel different, safer somehow. And I found myself telling him things I usually kept buried. How money never filled the emptiness, how comfort never erased the memories, how I still walked around like that poor girl from South Grove who never felt like she belonged anywhere. And he listened without interrupting, which broke me even more, because listening is sometimes the thing we need the most and get the least. And when I finished talking, he stepped a little closer, not enough to scare me, just enough to say he wasn't going anywhere. And the way he stood there under that broken streetlight made me realize this day was changing me in ways I didn't understand yet. But before either of us could say anything else, a car slowed down beside us, the window rolling down just enough to show someone watching us. And I felt the hair on my arms rise, because something about the moment felt wrong, like the peace we found was about to break again. And that's when I knew this night wasn't done testing me yet, not by a long shot. And the next second made everything twist in a way I didn't expect. The car that slowed beside us seemed innocent at first, just another old sedan rolling through a quiet street at the end of a long day. But the way it crept instead of passing, the way the window lowered only halfway, it made something cold move through me, the same kind of cold I used to feel back in South Grove, when strangers slowed near our house like they were searching for something to judge. And I saw David tense up beside me, his shoulders shifting, just a little like he was preparing himself without wanting me to notice. And I wished the streetlight above us wasn't flickering, because that shaky glow made everything feel more unclear, and I could barely see the face inside the car, just the outline of someone staring right at us, not blinking, not looking away. And that stare made my stomach tighten, because it felt personal, even though we didn't know them. And before I could ask David who it was, the person in the car laughed, a low laugh that felt wrong, then called out something about how we looked like a strange pair, me in my old uniform with tired shoes and him with his clean shirt and calm presence. And the words hit in that familiar way where people pointed out what they didn't understand. The mix of poor and better off. The difference in our worlds, and I wanted to hide behind that mask again. Pretend it didn't dig into an old wound. But David stepped forward slightly, placing himself just a little in front of me. Not aggressive, just protective, and told the driver to move along. His voice steady, but firm in a way I hadn't heard before. And the driver's face shifted, like he didn't appreciate being told what to do, especially not by someone who looked like he had his life put together. And for a second I feared it would turn into something worse, something messy, something that would drag me back into the kind of trouble I had spent years trying to avoid. But instead the driver muttered something under his breath, rolled up the window, and drove away slow enough to let us know he wasn't scared. And when the car finally disappeared down the road, the silence dropped heavy between us, heavier than before, and I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, my hands shaking a little even though I tried to hide it. But David noticed anyway and asked if I was okay. His voice softer now, and I nodded even though I wasn't sure I was. Because moments like that remind you how fragile life can be when you come from a world where danger knows your name. And he told me we should keep walking, that he didn't want me standing in the open like that any longer. And as we moved again, I felt something shift inside me, something small but real, like the first step of trust, forming whether I liked it or not. But then David glanced back down the road with a look that made my heart drop, because I could tell he hadn't liked the way the car left, and the worry in his eyes made it clear this night had more waiting for us than just shadows and cold air. As we kept walking, the quiet around us felt heavier than before, like the whole street was listening, and even though the car was long gone, its presence stayed in my mind the way bad memories do when they refuse to let go. And I noticed David checking over his shoulder every few steps, trying to be subtle, but the worry in his eyes gave him away, making me realize he wasn't just concerned for himself. He was watching out for me. And that thought settled deep in my chest in a way I didn't expect, because nobody outside my family ever looked out for me like that. Not when I was the poor girl wearing hand-me-downs and praying the world wouldn't notice my fear. And I tried to lighten the tension by asking if he thought the man in the car was someone he knew, maybe someone from his side of town who didn't like seeing him with someone like me. And David hesitated for just a second, a tiny pause that told me more than words could, before he said he didn't recognize the driver. But his tone made me think he wasn't fully sure. Or maybe he had an idea he didn't want to share yet, and that made my mind spin with questions I wasn't ready to ask. So I kept quiet and listened to our footsteps echo against the pavement, slow and steady, until we reached a small bridge that crossed over the creek behind the old mill, a place where the road narrowed and the woods pressed close, making everything feel tighter. And I felt my heartbeat rise again when I saw fresh tire marks near the entrance of the bridge, faint but real, like someone had stopped there not long ago. and I almost turned back, but David stepped beside me and told me it was okay, that he wouldn't let anything happen tonight. And even though I didn't know him well, I believed him more than I believed my own thoughts, maybe because the way he looked at me wasn't the way men looked at a girl they barely knew. It was the way someone looks at a person they want to protect. And as we crossed the bridge, he told me gently that the guy in the car had looked at me in a way that wasn't right, and he didn't want that kind of trouble near me. And I felt something warm and painful rise in my chest because I wasn't used to anyone naming the danger around me out loud. Most people pretended not to see it, and part of me wondered why David cared so much already, why he kept placing himself between me and trouble like it was natural to him. But before I could ask, a rustling sound came from the trees to our right, loud enough to make both of us stop at the same time, and David moved closer, his arm brushing against mine as he leaned forward just enough to block my view. And even though I couldn't see what was out there, I could feel the presence of something or someone watching us from the dark. The sound in the trees didn't fade the way small noises usually do when an animal runs off. It stayed there like a presence, holding its breath, and I felt the hairs on my arms rise because the dark around us suddenly felt too full, too still. And David's posture changed in a way I had never seen from him, his shoulders straightening and his jaw tightening, as if he already knew this night wasn't finished testing us. And he whispered for me to stay behind him, his voice low but steady. And even though a part of me wanted to argue and tell him I could handle myself, the truth was my legs felt weak. The kind of weakness that comes from old memories of danger mixing with fresh fear. And the bushes rustled again, slower this time, like whoever or whatever was inside them wanted us to know it hadn't left. And David stepped forward, only an inch, but enough to show someone out there that he wasn't scared. And I admired that even while my breath shook, because I had spent years learning how to hide fear with a mask. But David wasn't hiding anything. He was just standing there with a quiet strength that made me feel safe in a way I had never felt with anyone who wasn't family. And then the branches parted slightly, not enough for me to see a face, just the outline of a figure staying low, watching us the same way the driver in the car had watched, except this stare felt colder, more patient, and my hand instinctively grabbed David's sleeve even though I hadn't meant to. And he looked at me with a calmness that felt almost strange in a moment like this, telling me softly not to run, not to make sudden moves, because whoever was out there wanted us unsettled. And if we stayed steady, we'd take away the control they were trying to hold over us. And I swallowed hard, because steadiness wasn't something I had mastered yet, not when danger felt this close. But I stayed at his side anyway, letting the silence stretch until the figure in the bushes finally shifted back, as if retreating, the sound moving deeper into the woods, slow and dragging, like whoever it was wanted us to hear every step. And David let out a breath I didn't know he'd been holding, then turned to me with concern written across his face, asking if I was okay in a way that made me feel something I wasn't ready to name. And I nodded even though my heartbeat was still racing. And he said we needed to get out of that area before the person came back with more intention. But right before we continued walking, he glanced back into the trees with a frown, like something about that shadow hadn't made sense to him, and the look on his face made me realize this night was building toward something even bigger than either of us understood. We moved quickly away from the edge of the woods, the quiet night pressing close around us. But even as we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching, lingering in the darkness just beyond what my eyes could reach. And David kept glancing over his shoulder, each time his expression tightening in a way that made my stomach twist, because I knew he wasn't used to being caught off guard like this. And if he felt the weight of uncertainty, then I should be even more afraid. Yet there was a strange comfort in walking beside him, knowing he wouldn't let anything reach me without a fight. And I kept thinking about the morning at the diner, the way he had waited, the way he had looked at me. And it all came together in that moment, like a thread weaving through the fear, tying us together in a way I didn't expect. And we reached the street where my apartment building was, the dim light casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks. And I could see the door to my building ahead, a place I had always thought of as safe. But now it felt small, too close, like even home couldn't protect me fully from the outside world. And David slowed beside me, his voice quiet but firm as he asked if I wanted him to walk me inside. And I hesitated, caught between wanting safety and wanting to keep this strange tension going just a little longer. And finally, I nodded, feeling the warmth of his presence next to me as we approached the entrance. But the moment we reached the steps, a sudden sound behind us made me freeze. A low, deliberate footstep, different from the rush of our own steps or the wind moving leaves. And my heart jumped in my chest as I turned slightly to see a shadow slipping across the sidewalk behind us, too large and deliberate to be just an animal. And David's hand brushed mine instinctively, a silent signal to stay close. And I realized that this person had followed us from the street, or maybe even from the diner, someone who had noticed the connection forming between us and didn't want it to continue. And the thought made the tension in my chest tighten, because I had never known anyone to pay that much attention to me before, not since I was a child learning how to navigate the world with my mask on. And now, as I climbed the steps into the building, the shadow hesitated, and David's eyes narrowed, scanning every corner, every movement in the dark, trying to measure what we were dealing with. And I felt a mixture of fear and something else, something I couldn't name yet, because even in danger, there was a pull in me that kept me close to him. And as I reached my apartment door, fumbling for my keys, I realized this night wasn't going to end quietly, and the person outside wasn't finished with us, leaving me holding the doorknob with a trembling hand, heart hammering, and a question forming in my mind about what exactly we had walked into, and how much of it I was truly ready to face. I slipped inside my apartment and closed the door slowly, trying to make it sound normal. But the quiet click felt loud in the small space, and David stayed right behind me, his presence steady and calm, like a wall I could lean on without thinking about it. And I could feel my pulse racing in a way I hadn't felt in years. Because the shadow outside wasn't just a stranger. It was a reminder that my life, no matter how ordinary it seemed, always had cracks where danger could seep in. And I realized for the first time how exposed I really was, not just in the streets or near the diner, but in every moment I had let my guard down, thinking I was safe, thinking my mask could hide me from the world. And David noticed the tension in my shoulders and asked if I wanted him to stay until I felt safe, and I nodded without speaking, because even saying it out loud made me feel vulnerable, a feeling I wasn't used to sharing with anyone, especially someone who didn't belong to my world. And we moved toward the living room where the lights were dim, the shadows stretching across the walls like reminders of the street we had just left. And as I sank onto the couch, I realized how much I had been holding in all these years: the fear, the longing, the need to be seen without judgment. And David sat across from me, close enough that I could feel the quiet warmth radiating from him, asking gently about my day, about the diner, about the small things I never shared with anyone. And for the first time, I let a little of the mask slip, telling him about the morning, about Leon, about the car, about the moment I had felt small and noticed at the same time. And he listened, not judging, not pitying, just hearing me in a way that made me feel strange and unsteady and alive all at once. And when I finished, he didn't say much at first, just nodded slowly, as if every word I had spoken sank into him, changing something quietly. And then he asked something I wasn't ready for: why I let the world push me into corners, why I hid behind walls instead of asking for help, why I carried pain like it was a secret treasure. And his words made me pause, because no one had ever asked me that before. And the room felt heavier with unspoken truths, and I realized he wasn't just noticing the surface. He was seeing the cracks I had spent decades hiding, and the thought that someone could see that much of me and still stay without leaving made my chest ache in a way I didn't understand. And before I could answer, he reached toward me with a quiet hand, not touching, but close enough to signal he wasn't going anywhere. And that gesture, simple and careful, made me wonder if this night, this strange first day, was going to change the way I looked at the world, and more than anything, at myself, because for the first time, I didn't have to wear my mask, not fully, not with him. And that realization made a soft, trembling hope rise inside me, even as the shadows outside my window reminded me that nothing in life stayed simple, and the next moment would ask me to choose how much of that hope I was willing to hold on till we stayed in the quiet of my small living room for a long moment, neither of us moving much. And I realized how strange it felt to sit with someone who didn't push me to explain, who didn't judge the life I had, yet somehow made me feel like I had to confront truths I had hidden even from myself. And David finally spoke softly, asking if I ever let myself hope for something better, something real, something that wasn't tied to struggle or fear. And the question hit me hard, because hope was dangerous in my world. It always came with a price. And yet I wanted to say yes, wanted to admit that I dreamed sometimes of a life where pain didn't follow me, where I could be seen and safe and free without wearing a mask. And I hesitated before speaking, letting the weight of his presence anchor me. And I told him I did hope, though rarely. And even those small hopes were tucked away like fragile glass, hidden in the corners of my heart. And he nodded, like he understood more than I could explain. And then he asked if I believed that people could change their path, that a life built on struggle could somehow become something different if given the right moments. And I blinked at him, because that question wasn't abstract, it was personal. It touched every ache and secret I carried. And I admitted quietly that sometimes I wondered if change was even possible, if life ever gave second chances without demanding a price I couldn't pay. And he smiled softly, not with arrogance or pity, but with the calm certainty of someone who had seen and understood more than he had to. And he said that maybe we just needed the right day, the right person, the right small shift to start. And I wanted to believe him, even as my mind screamed that life had taught me otherwise. And then he paused, looking down at his hands for a moment. And when he finally looked up, his eyes met mine in a way that made the air between us feel heavier, more intimate, because I realized he wasn't just talking in general. He was speaking about this moment, about us, about the first step of something I didn't fully understand, but felt in the pit of my chest. And before I could respond, the distant hum of the street below reminded me that life didn't pause for quiet revelations, that the shadows outside were still there, still patient, still watching. And David reached toward me again, the tip of his fingers just brushing mine in the faintest gesture of connection. And that small touch made something inside me tilt, like a door I had locked long ago was nudged just enough to open a crack. And I realized that this night, this strange first day, wasn't over, that the choices we made in these small, fragile moments could ripple further than I dared imagine. And I didn't know if I was ready for it. Yet I felt a pull toward it, toward him, toward the possibility that maybe hope didn't have to be dangerous. Maybe it could be simple. Maybe it could be real. And that thought, soft and trembling, held me in a way that made my chest ache with longing, fear, and an unfamiliar, fragile kind of trust. The soft, quiet between us stretched, filled only by the faint hum of the city outside and the occasional creak of the old floorboards. And I realized how unusual it was to have someone stay this close without asking for anything in return, without judgment, without pressure, just presence. And it made me think about the years I had spent learning to survive, to hide, to keep my pain contained behind the mask I wore. And David seemed to notice the shift inside me, the subtle tremor of emotions I tried to control, because he asked gently if I had anyone I could talk to like this, someone who saw me without pretense. And the question made my throat tighten, because the answer was no. I didn't, not really. And saying that out loud felt like letting the air out of a tightly held balloon, fragile and necessary. And he nodded slowly, understanding that silence more than words could. And then he said something that caught me off guard. He told me that sometimes people come into your life not to fix everything, not to make the pain disappear, but just to be there for a single moment that matters. And that moment, he said, can change the way you see the rest of your life if you let it. And I stared at him because I wanted to reject it, to tell myself it was just words, just kindness from someone who would leave. But the way he looked at me, steady and patient, made it impossible to push it away. And I realized I wanted to believe him, wanted to allow the thought that this night could be more than just a random encounter, that maybe it could be the beginning of something I had never dared to hope for. And the thought made my chest ache in a quiet, persistent way, the ache of wanting more than I had ever allowed myself to want. And before I could speak, David leaned back slightly, not to give distance, but to create space. And he asked if I wanted to share the stories I never told, the ones I carried hidden behind the mask. And I felt a pull in me I hadn't recognized in years, the urge to unburden, to let someone see the pain and fear and hope all at once. And I hesitated because vulnerability was dangerous. It had cost me too much before. But something in the way he waited, the calm patience in his eyes, made me start. And I told him small pieces, quiet stories of struggle, of missing meals, of nights when my mother worried too much and I had to act strong, of moments when the world seemed too heavy to carry. And yet I carried it anyway. And with every word, the weight in my chest lifted slightly because he didn't react with shock or pity. He just listened. And the quiet acceptance in that room felt almost impossible, almost unreal. And yet, I couldn't deny that it mattered, that it changed something in me, a tiny crack forming in the walls I had built around myself. And when I finished, I realized my voice had grown steadier, softer, more certain. Because for the first time in a long time, someone had seen me and stayed, and I wasn't alone in the weight of my own life. And the thought of what might come next, of what this night could become, made my heart race with cautious hope and quiet fear all at once. After a while, the quiet felt heavy in a different way, not tense, but full of possibilities I wasn't sure I was ready to face. And David's calm presence beside me made it feel safer than anything I had known outside my family. Yet the small tremor in my chest reminded me that nothing in life ever stayed safe for long. And I realized that I had spent so many years hiding not just my pain, but my desires, my hopes, even my small joys, behind a mask of caution and practicality. And now, sitting across from someone who neither judged nor demanded, I felt the strange pull of wanting to let it all out, to admit the truth of what it was like to grow up poor, to carry the weight of responsibility from the moment I could understand it, to feel the sting of being looked down on by those with money, while being invisible to those who should have cared. And David listened quietly as I spoke, not interrupting, letting me pour out pieces of myself I didn't even realize I had kept hidden. And I could feel the tension in my body easing just slightly, though my heart still raced at the vulnerability of it all. And then he asked me softly if I ever allowed myself to dream without fear, without thinking someone would judge me or take advantage of the hope I held. And I paused because the truth was, I rarely did. I had trained myself to survive, to expect disappointment, to brace for pain. But the way he asked, calm and patient, made me want to try. to imagine just for a moment a life where hope didn't come with a warning, a life where I could trust someone enough to let them stay in my world, even if only for a moment. And I admitted quietly that I did dream sometimes, though I didn't often allow it to stay. And he nodded slowly, like he understood exactly what that meant. And then he said something that made me catch my breath, that maybe hope wasn't dangerous if you shared it carefully with someone who respected it. And I looked at him, seeing the quiet honesty in his eyes, and I realized that for the first time in a long time, someone might actually be worth letting in. Someone who wouldn't take advantage of the parts of me I had spent years guarding. And that thought both thrilled and terrified me, because I wasn't used to letting anyone close, and now I was beginning to wonder if maybe, just maybe, this strange day, this unexpected stranger, could change more than just the way I walked through the streets. It could change how I saw myself, how I allowed myself to feel, and how much of my own life I could finally reclaim, piece by piece, without shame or fear. And as I sat there in the dim glow of my apartment, I realized that the night wasn't just about danger or surprise encounters anymore. It was about something deeper, something I had been avoiding for decades, and I didn't yet know if I was ready to embrace it. But I felt the pull of it, a quiet insistence that this moment, fragile as it was, mattered more than I could measure. The longer we stayed in that quiet apartment, the more I noticed the small details of David's presence, the way he didn't fidget, the way he gave me space while still staying close, the way his eyes softened when I spoke about my past. And it made me realize how rare it was to be seen like that without being judged or pitied. And I felt a strange mix of relief and fear, because I had spent decades believing that no one could handle the truth of my life without turning away or looking down on me. And yet here he was, listening, steady, patient, and without expectation. And I found myself opening up further, telling him about the nights I had cried alone, about the times I had gone hungry so my little brother could eat, about the moments when I had watched others move through life easily, wishing I could be invisible or strong enough to not feel the sting. And he never interrupted, never offered a solution, just stayed, holding the space for me to speak the unspoken. And when I finished, my chest ached with exhaustion and relief, and David leaned back slightly and asked me a question that made my heart tighten. If I had ever thought that someone could truly care about me, not for what I could give, not for appearances, but for who I really was. And I froze, because the answer was complicated. But the longing in me wanted to say yes, wanted to admit that I had wished for it quietly my entire life. And finally, I whispered that sometimes I had dared to hope, though I hadn't dared to believe it fully. And he smiled, just a small, calm smile, not prideful, not indulgent, just honest. And he said that maybe hope didn't have to be quiet, that maybe it could be something you allowed yourself to carry openly, carefully, without shame. And I looked at him and felt a trembling warmth in my chest, a mix of fear, longing, and something fragile that felt like possibility. And for the first time that night, I let my mask slip almost entirely, realizing that being seen, truly seen, was more powerful than any secret I had carried. And as I sat there, the city hum outside my window fading into background noise. I knew this night had changed something in me, something deep and quiet, something that would follow me into tomorrow, into the days after that, shaping the way I approached the world. And even though I didn't know what came next, I felt a soft certainty that this stranger, this calm presence who entered my life so unexpectedly, wasn't just a fleeting moment, but the start of a shift I hadn't realized I needed. And I wondered quietly if I could trust someone enough to step into the spaces I had always kept locked. The night stretched on, and even as the city lights dimmed outside my window, the weight of everything that had happened today, the diner, the car, the shadows, the walks, the quiet moments of honesty, settled over me like a heavy blanket. Yet for the first time in years, it didn't feel suffocating. It felt real. And I realized how rarely I allowed myself to feel real without the mask I had spent decades perfecting. And David stayed there, quietly present, watching me in a way that didn't demand or judge. And I felt the pull to reach for him, to let someone else share the load I had carried alone for so long. But fear lingered at the edges, reminding me of the lessons life had taught me about trust and disappointment, about how quickly hope could be broken, and yet the warmth of his calm presence made that fear soften just enough that I could imagine a different kind of tomorrow, one where the weight wasn't mine alone. And I started to speak quietly about the small dreams I had buried, the idea of a life where comfort didn't feel like guilt, where love didn't demand sacrifice, where being seen didn't come with judgment. And as I spoke, David listened with that quiet patience that made me realize he wasn't just hearing words. He was hearing the truth of my life, the hidden cracks, the fears I hadn't let anyone witness. And I felt a strange courage rising in me, a courage I hadn't known I possessed, because I could see that maybe, just maybe, sharing those truths didn't make me weaker. It made me human. And he asked me softly what I wanted from tomorrow, from life, and I hesitated because the question wasn't easy. It wasn't abstract. It was deeply personal. And I whispered that I wanted to feel safe, to be valued, to exist without constantly hiding. And he nodded, as if those simple desires carried weight enough to be revolutionary. And then he said something quiet that made my chest tighten, that maybe tomorrow could be different if I allowed it, if I let someone in, if I stopped carrying it all alone. And I realized that I wanted to believe him more than I had allowed myself to want in years. And as I looked at him, the room heavy with shadows and possibility, I understood that this night, strange and unexpected, had shifted something inside me. The careful walls I had built starting to crack, not from pressure, but from the quiet insistence of connection. And I felt both terrified and relieved at the thought of letting someone into a life I had guarded so fiercely. And the next morning, whatever it held, would demand I decide how much of myself I was willing to show, and whether hope, fragile as it was, could survive in a world that had long taught me to hide mourning, came slow and quiet. The soft light slipping through my curtains like it was hesitant to enter, and I stayed in bed a few moments longer than usual, feeling the weight of everything from last night pressing gently against me. The diner, the car, the shadows, the walks, the talks, all weaving together into a tapestry I hadn't expected, and I realized how strange it was to feel both frightened and comforted at the same time, because David's presence had shifted something deep inside me, something I hadn't known could be shifted. And even though the streets would wake soon, with people moving and talking and living their lives without concern for my fragile hope, I felt a quiet strength I hadn't felt in years. The kind that comes from being seen without judgment, from sharing pieces of yourself you thought were too heavy for anyone to bear. And I thought about the mask I had worn for decades, the one that kept me safe, but also kept me small. And I knew, softly, that it was time to let it rest, at least a little, because I had discovered that someone could care without wanting to take. Someone could stay without leaving. Someone could see the cracks and still not turn away. And that realization made my chest ache in a quiet, hopeful way. And when I dressed and prepared for the day, the usual rush of responsibilities and errands felt different, lighter somehow, because part of my heart had been touched by a connection I had never allowed myself to believe in before. And I thought about the day ahead, about the diner, about the life I had built from nothing, about the people who didn't understand my journey. And I understood that even with all the challenges, all the pain, all the reminders of where I came from, there could be moments of beauty and trust, moments where hope was not dangerous but necessary. And as I stepped outside into the crisp morning air, I felt David's words echo quietly in my mind, reminding me that the small, careful steps mattered, that allowing someone in didn't mean giving up. It meant growing. And I looked down the street where we had walked last night, imagining him waiting there with that quiet patience that had shifted something in me. And I smiled softly, knowing that today, and perhaps many days after, life might demand courage, might demand vulnerability, but it could also offer moments of gentle trust, moments that made the weight of the past feel less heavy, moments that whispered, even quietly, that maybe, just maybe, pain didn't have to be carried alone. And as I moved forward into the day, I felt a fragile, trembling hope settle into my chest, ready to grow, ready to shape the life I had only just begun to imagine. And softly, I whispered a thank you into the empty morning for the unexpected gift of someone who had seen me.